Welcome to the Business Line editorial analysis on May 6, 2022. The first editorial I am going to discuss today is Turbulence Ahead. The editorial refers to global inflation as the turbulence and the inflation will be higher in the coming days. In the context, US Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of US, has raised 50 basis points hike in federal fund rates. The US Federal Reserve also has announced balance sheet contraction which will begin in June. What are these terms and what is their impact on inflation? Let us understand. The US personal consumption expenditures inflation has hit a 40-year high of 5.2% in March. The US Federal Reserve's target of inflation is 2%. The US PC inflation is the rise in prices on the consumer side. The US Federal Reserve plans to hike another 90 basis points during 2022 in addition to the present increase of 50 basis points. The Federal Reserve also plans to reduce its balance sheet, which is now at $8.9 trillion. Reducing the balance sheet means selling the securities held by US Federal Reserve in US securities market. The US Federal Reserve also plans to reduce its holding of treasury securities by $30 billion each month in second quarter of 2022 and $60 billion per month thereafter. The US Federal Reserve also plans to reduce holding of agency debt and mortgage-backed securities by $17.5 billion for 3 months from June and thereafter reduce the double of it. The mortgage-backed securities by agency reduces the mortgage rates and makes home loans accessible. By these monetary policy tightening measures, US Federal Reserve tries to suck excess liquidity from the market and make loans expensive. The impact of Federal Reserve's monetary tightening measures will be felt by economies across the world because US investors constitute 50% of global investors. In India, the foreign capital will fly away and perch upon dollar denominated securities in US. The second article I am going to discuss is There is no escaping a growth sacrifice. The writer is concerned that the present monetary tightening stance by the Monetary Policy Committee of RBI will sacrifice growth in the economy. The economy will move in the disinflation path. Disinflation implies slowing down the rate of inflation. The growth will be affected as the control over inflation will bring down production of manufactured articles. Post-pandemic, the RBI had followed the path of accommodative stance, which implies keeping the repo rates and cash reserve ratio at stagnant rates to foster growth in the economy. The article discusses the Occam's law. The Occam's law states that for every 2% fall in GDP, unemployment rises at about 1%. Thus, unemployment will set to rise. This is a proven theory in Indian context also, where India witnessed 0.13% fall in employment with every 1% decline in GDP between 1980 to 81 to 2019 to 20. The article discusses the concept liquidity overhang. The liquidity overhang results from surplus liquidity in the economy. The concept of liquidity adjustment facility needs to be understood in this context. The LF for short, it is the tool used in the monetary policy by RBI in which the rate at which banks borrow from RBI is determined. The call money rate is the rate at which banks borrow for short-term cash needs. The standing deposit facility was introduced post-demonetization to allow RBI to borrow from banks at reverse repo rate without increasing the collateral, that is, government securities. Since demonetization flushed banks with excess liquidity, SDF comes handy at times to absorb this excess liquidity, as SDF is without collateral. When the short-term borrowing call money rate or repo went below the SDF, the excess liquidity got built up in the economy. This is the liquidity overhang. The ways and means grants to governments also contributed to this liquidity overhang, which RBI proposes to absorb now. The third article to be discussed is India cannot be faulted for buying Russian oil. The Ukraine war has left European Union and US passing economic sanctions on Russia. There is a sanction on buying Russian oil. Sanction implies penalty for breaking the international law. India is mocked at by Western media for its stand on remaining an importer of oil from Russia even after the Ukraine war. Russian oil is economical. The stand by OPEC made India to depend on Russia for its petroleum needs. OPEC is the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, and it is an intergovernmental organization of 13 countries and is headquartered in Vienna in Austria. It was founded in 14th September 1960. The OPEC coordinates the petroleum policies of its members. The member countries are Algeria, Angola, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. As per the estimates, around 79.4% of the world's oil reserves are located in OPEC. The bulk of OPEC reserves is in Middle East, amounting to 64.5% of the total. The OPEC members meet every month in Vienna to discuss oil supply to the world. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the OPEC cut short supply of oil by 10 million barrels a day. When the demand for crude recovered post-COVID, they started supplying an extra 4 lakhs barrels per day. The supply is still 2.5 million barrels per day short of pre-pandemic levels. The Ukraine war aggravated the crisis. The slowing down supplies by OPEC is the chief reason for soaring oil prices amid Ukraine crisis. India is left with no option but to go for cheaper Russian oil. The article suggests finding a better way to punish Russia than sanctions. It includes the trade revenues to be partly deposited to an escrow account to fund rebuilding Ukraine. The second solution is imposing a global uniform tariff for imports from nations supporting terrorism. The article also discusses OPEC's oligopoly, which implies a limited number of suppliers controlling the market. The fourth article to be discussed is the anatomy of the coal crisis. The country is searing under power shortages. The COVID economy recovery and unexpected heat wave is creating huge demand for power. To add salt to the injury, the country is heavily dependent on coal imports, which catapults the cost of energy. The coal procurement by the coal syndicate is done on a war footing. The coal syndicate consists of Coal India, the railways, thermal power plants, and DISCOM or distribution companies. We are having the fifth largest reserves of coal. Yet, India is the second largest importer of coal at 125 million tons. The UPA government then had liberally allocated coal blocks for captive use by thermal power plants and cement and steel industries. Captive mining reduced costs and the burden on Coal India was also reduced. The same could bring down the cost of power. This was criticized by CAG that price maximization was not achieved and hence a presumed loss figure of rupees 10.67 lakhs crores was notionally arrived at by CAG. To add to the woes, the Supreme Court cancelled the allocation of 214 coal blocks in 2014. The cancelled blocks had a reserve of about 28 billion tons with annual production capacity of 500 million tons. This cancellation of coal blocks by the top court of the country is causing an artificial shortage now. Meanwhile, power investments by private sector grew rapidly and hence the imports became inevitable. The international coal prices are at $400 a ton now and are rising in tune with the prices of oil and gas. Much of the thermal power plants which had captive mines cancelled by the apex court has now become non-performing asset as logistics for bringing coal to these mines did not exist. The only solution to these problems is allowing domestic coal reserves to be exploited. The fifth article to be discussed is tea industry needs to brew a management revamp. The article acknowledges that the profitability index of tea industry in India stood at 10.4, the highest among all industries in India. The profitability index is now in the negative zone. The consumption has come down and the export is at a 15-year low. There is drop in price discovery and realization and mounting costs add to the crisis. The tea industry's labor costs come around 60 to 65% of the total costs. The wages costs are determined by way of biparty or triparty agreements along with trade unions. The article suggests learning management principles and applying them in tea industry. Learning management principles is the key to resolving the challenges of the industry. Management principles are defined in the article. The application of skills and techniques is in a sequential manner is management. The basic functions of management are planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling. Planning involves determining objectives and strategies. Organizing is the process of designing activities and fixing responsibility. Staffing is the employing of workers. Directing is the process of performance-oriented activation of plans through individual and group efforts. And then controlling is the process of monitoring the activities of the organization post implementation. The strategy should be qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative like marketing, sales and profits. Qualitative like becoming the leader in the market. While organizing, the optimum utilization of resources must be thought of. While planning profit, society should not be forgotten.